The sun dipped beneath the jagged horizon, casting a deep orange glow across the alien landscape. Ethan, a young human diplomat, stepped off the transport shuttle with a sense of awe. The air was thick with the smell of unfamiliar flora, and the landscape stretched endlessly before him, teeming with bizarre yet fascinating life. He had been on many missions before, but this one was different. This mission wasn't just about peace talks. This was about understanding an ancient warrior race that had never before been in contact with humans. Ethan had read all the reports, studied the alien cultures, and even practiced their greetings, but there was one thing he hadn't prepared for: their warriors. The Kolan, a race of towering, heavily armored beings known for their incredible strength and fierce battle skills, were nothing like the species he had dealt with before. They didn't just talk, they fought for honor, and every gesture, every word was a challenge to their pride. He stood alongside his fellow diplomats, all of them gathered near the central meeting point, a vast, open courtyard surrounded by enormous stone pillars, each etched with ancient symbols of Kolan history. The air was silent, except for the distant hum of hovering ships and the soft murmur of the Kolan leaders as they awaited the arrival of their greatest warrior. Ethan's heart raced, knowing that his every move would be scrutinized. Kalira stepped onto the scene like a force of nature. She was the Kolan's greatest warrior, known for her skill in battle and her unshakable resolve. Towering at almost 7 feet tall, she moved with a grace that belied her size. Her armor, made of a shimmering metallic alloy, covered her from head to toe, but it did little to hide the powerful muscles beneath. Her face was hidden behind a dark helmet, leaving only her sharp, calculating eyes visible. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as she approached. He had heard the legends of Kalira, stories of her fierce battles, her unwavering loyalty to her people. This was no mere warrior. This was someone who had shaped the fate of entire planets with her blade. But Ethan wasn't intimidated. He had been trained to handle such situations, and he had one tool that could break the tension between them: humor. As Kalira came to a stop before the group, her eyes scanning each diplomat in turn, Ethan, perhaps a bit too casually, said, "Well, you certainly don't look like someone who'd be called cute, but I guess that's what happens when you're this tough." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and as soon as they left his mouth, the entire courtyard went silent. The other diplomat stiffened, looking anywhere but at the towering alien warrior. The Kolan leader's eyes widened in shock, and even Kalira herself froze, her expression unreadable behind the helmet. Ethan's face turned beet red as he realized his mistake. What had he just said? Cute? Of all the things to say to a legendary warrior, that was the last word he expected to come out of his mouth. He had meant it as a joke, something lighthearted to break the ice, but he could see now that this wasn't a situation for jokes. He quickly tried to backtrack, raising his hands in an apologetic gesture. "I mean, not that you aren't tough, of course. You're, quite intimidating, actually. Very fearsome." Kalira's eyes locked onto him, piercing through, the awkwardness that hung in the air like a thick fog. For a moment, it seemed as though she would strike him down for the insult, her hand twitching toward the hilt of her massive sword. But then something unexpected happened. Her lips, hidden beneath the helmet, twitched almost imperceptibly. Was it a smile? No, it couldn't be. The entire room held its breath. Then, as if deciding on a whim, Kalira slowly, deliberately, placed her hands on her hips. Her voice, though cold and commanding, held an edge of something Ethan couldn't quite place. "Human, you call me cute?" Her tone wasn't hostile, but there was an unmistakable challenge in her words. Ethan felt the heat rise in his face, again. He had no idea what to say. He had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed. I didn't mean it that way. I meant it like, cute, in a strong way, you know?" His words felt weak as they left his mouth. Kalira tilted her head, her expression unreadable. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Ethan half expected her to draw her weapon and end the conversation right there, but to his surprise, she didn't. Instead, she stood there staring at him with an almost curious intensity. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Ethan swallowed hard, hoping for the ground to open up and swallow him whole. Finally, Kalira spoke again, her voice low but not unkind. "You, human, are strange." She gave him a long, deliberate look, as if sizing him up in a way that made Ethan feel like an insect under a magnifying glass. "But I will allow it. For now." Her words hung in the air, leaving Ethan to wonder what exactly had just happened. He had expected an angry outburst, or worse, immediate violence. Instead, he got this cryptic approval that made no sense at all. The silence stretched on, but Kalira's gaze never wavered from him. Ethan could feel the weight of her stare, a mix of curiosity and something else, something softer, though he couldn't quite define it. He had somehow made it through the first encounter with the Colon warrior without being torn apart, but as he stood there trying to recover from his embarrassing slip, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Maybe Kalira had reacted this way because she was used to being feared, not admired in such a strange way. Maybe no one had ever dared to call her anything other than a warrior before. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan had just cracked open a door he wasn't ready to walk through. As the diplomats began to move on with the discussions, Ethan couldn't help but glance back at Kalira, who had returned to her position beside the Kolan leaders. Her posture remained as fierce and commanding as before, but now there was a faint, almost imperceptible softness to her presence that hadn't been there before. It was as if the tiniest crack had appeared in the armor of the great warrior. Ethan had no idea what would come of it, but one thing was clear. He had just made a powerful enemy, one who might just end up being more than he bargained for. The days after Ethan's unexpected comment seemed to stretch on forever. Every time he looked at Kalira, he felt the weight of his words, and he couldn't shake the thought that he had made a terrible mistake. The other diplomats were polite, but there was a noticeable tension in the air every time Kalira's name was mentioned. It was as if they were all silently waiting for the warrior to react. But Kalira didn't react the way Ethan had expected. After that first encounter, she had returned to her usual stern, powerful self. She didn't make any mention of the cute comment, and in fact she seemed to be treating Ethan with a kind of distant respect. But that didn't make things any easier for him. If anything, it made everything more confusing. Ethan tried to focus on the purpose of his mission, negotiating a peace treaty between two powerful factions on the planet Kolar. The Kolan warriors, led by Kalira, had been asked to help mediate the conflict. Ethan and his fellow diplomats were there to help facilitate the peace talks, but every time he spoke with the Kolan leaders, he couldn't help but feel the weight of Kalira's gaze upon him. Each time they crossed paths, her eyes would briefly meet his, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire universe stood still. It wasn't hostility he saw in her expression, but something else, something he couldn't quite define. Was it curiosity, or was she just waiting for him to say something else absurd? One afternoon, after a long meeting in the council hall, Ethan found himself walking alone along the high cliffs of the Kolan capital. The wind howled around him, and the strange alien landscape stretched as far as the eye could see. It was peaceful here, a rare moment of solitude amidst the chaos of peace talks. But Ethan couldn't fully relax. Every time his mind wandered, it would return to Kalira and that one moment of unexpected softness. He had thought warriors like her were untouchable, their emotions hidden behind thick armor and fierce pride. But after that brief, almost imperceptible change in her expression, he wasn't so sure anymore. Suddenly, a voice broke the stillness, and Ethan spun around to see Kalira standing a few feet behind him, her towering figure framed against the vast open sky. She had a slight tilt to her head as if studying him. "You walk alone," she said, her voice as deep and commanding as ever. Ethan felt his throat tighten. I like the quiet here. It's different from Earth." Kalira didn't respond immediately. She stepped closer, her boots crunching against the rocky ground, her armor gleaming in the fading sunlight. "You have questions," she said, her tone not unkind but more like a statement of fact. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I do. I don't understand you, or your people." Kalira raised an eyebrow beneath her helmet, clearly intrigued. And what is it that you don't understand, human? Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. I didn't mean to offend you when I called you cute. I don't know what I was thinking. I thought you might take it as a joke, but I realize now that was stupid. For a moment, Kalira remained silent, and Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He expected her to laugh it off or even berate him for his mistake, but she did neither. Instead, she simply studied him for a long time, her eyes unreadable. Why do you care? She finally asked, her voice softening just a fraction. Why? Does it matter if you offended me? Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question. I guess because I don't want you to think I'm some kind of fool. I don't want you to see me as weak. Kalira took a step closer, the distance between them closing. You think I see you as weak? She asked, her voice low, almost amused. Ethan felt a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Aren't humans weak to you? Compared to your people, I mean? Kalira paused, her gaze turning distant for a moment as if considering his words carefully. Weakness is not about size or strength, it's about how you carry yourself. It's about your actions. I see strength in you, human, not in your size, but in your resolve. Ethan felt his stomach churn, not from fear, but from something deeper. Something that felt almost like admiration. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do what's needed here. We're supposed to negotiate peace, but I don't understand. All the customs and histories of your people. I don't know what I'm walking into. Kalira's eyes softened just a fraction. No one does. Not fully. Peace is a complicated thing. It's not a matter of words, but of understanding, patience, and the willingness to listen. The Colon have fought wars for centuries, but we are also a people of great pride. Our strength is not only in battle, but in our ability to adapt and endure. Ethan listened carefully, trying to make sense of her words. So what do you think will happen here? Do you think peace is even possible? Kalira looked away, her gaze turning toward the distant horizon, as if searching for something. In the vastness of the alien world, I hope so. But hope alone will not be enough. It will take more than just words, it will take action. Ethan didn't know how to respond. He had expected Kalira to be cold and distant, but instead, he was starting to see another side of her. A side that wasn't just about brute strength, but about wisdom, patience, and a deep understanding of the world around her. For the first time since their strange meeting, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this mission than he had realized. Maybe Kalira wasn't just a warrior. Maybe she was something more. Something that could help him understand not only the Colon people but also himself. As the wind picked up around them, Kalira spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. You are not weak, human. But you must learn to listen, to understand. You must prove that you are worthy of standing beside us. Ethan nodded, his heart racing as he realized the gravity of her words. He wasn't just here to negotiate peace. He was here to earn the respect of the Colon people, especially Kalira. It wouldn't be easy, but he was beginning to believe that it was possible. As they stood together on the edge of the cliff, the setting sun painting the sky with shades of purple and gold, Ethan knew one thing for sure. He had only just begun to understand what it meant to be truly strong. The days passed quickly, and as the peace talks continued, Ethan found himself spending more time with Kalira. The intensity of the negotiations required the diplomats to work closely with the Colon leaders, and Kalira, as the highest-ranking warrior, was often at the center of these discussions. It wasn't long before Ethan realized that she wasn't just a soldier. She was a critical part of the peace process, a bridge between two opposing factions. Each meeting was tense, filled with complicated debates over resources, territory, and old grudges. But Kalira's presence was calming. She didn't speak much during the talks, but when she did, her voice was firm, commanding, and always respectful. Ethan couldn't help but admire her strength. It wasn't the kind of strength that came from a raised sword or a battle won. It was the quiet, unwavering strength of someone who believed in their mission. no matter the cost. One evening, after another long meeting, Ethan and Kalira found themselves alone in the Colon barracks, reviewing the day's discussions. Ethan had hoped to ask her about the next steps, but as he sat across from her, he found it difficult to speak. The silence between them was comfortable, but it also felt charged, as if something unspoken was lingering in the air. Kalira was sitting across from him, her helmet resting on the table beside her. Without the heavy armor, she looked more human, and yet still so different. Her sharp features softened in the light, but her eyes retained that fierce glint that Ethan had come to associate with her. Her gaze wasn't challenging now, but thoughtful, as if she was deep in her own thoughts. Ethan broke the silence, his voice tentative. "You're different from what I expected." Kalira didn't react at first, her gaze still fixed on him. "How so?" He hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "I thought you would be colder, more distant. But you're not like that. You're more human than I imagined." A slight smile flickered across Kalira's face, though it was small and fleeting. "I am Kolan," she replied simply, but there was a hint of something more in her words, something that Ethan couldn't quite grasp. "You're a warrior," Ethan said, his voice almost in awe. "But you don't just fight. You listen. You care about what happens here." Kalira's expression softened. "Fighting is one part of what we are, but it is not everything. We have a duty to our people, but we also have a duty to each other. The Colon are not just warriors. We are protectors, leaders, and yes, sometimes diplomats." Ethan nodded, his admiration for her growing. "I didn't understand that until now. I thought you were all just warriors driven by strength and honor, but you've shown me there's more to it than that." Kalira didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked away, her gaze drifting toward the window where the stars twinkled in the night sky. "We are all shaped by our experiences," she said quietly. "And we are shaped by the people we meet along the way. You, human, have taught me something I did not expect." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" She turned back to him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see right through him. "You have taught me that strength is not only about what we can do in battle. It is about what we can endure, what we can protect, what we can build together." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach as he processed her words. Kalira, the great Colon warrior, was speaking to him not as a superior, but as an equal. And, for the first time, he realized that their bond was starting to shift. They were no longer just diplomat and warrior. They were becoming something more. He wasn't sure what exactly that was yet, but the feeling was undeniable. Before he could respond, Kalira stood, her movements graceful despite her imposing size. "The peace talks continue tomorrow," she said, her voice returning to its usual firmness. "We cannot rest yet, there is still much to do." Ethan stood as well, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him once again. "I know. But Kalira, thank you. I mean it. I'm starting to understand why this mission is so important, not just for my people, but for yours as well." Kalira gave a brief nod, the briefest flicker of approval in her eyes. "We fight for more than just ourselves, human. We fight for a future where both our peoples can coexist without the need for war." Ethan nodded, knowing that they still had a long way to go. But with Kalira by his side, he felt a newfound sense of hope. She had taught him something invaluable, that peace wasn't just a negotiation. It was a shared goal, one that required effort, understanding, and above all, trust. Over the next few days, Ethan and Kalira continued to work closely together. The peace talks became more focused, and despite the numerous challenges, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The Colon and human factions were beginning to trust each other more, and that trust came in part from the bond that had developed between Ethan and Kalira. But it wasn't just about words. The more they spent time together, the more Ethan realized that Kalira's strength wasn't just in her ability to fight. It was in her ability to endure. She had lived through countless battles, wars, and losses, yet she carried herself with dignity and wisdom. She had seen the worst of the universe, but still, she believed in the possibility of peace. One afternoon, as the two of them were walking through the Kolan gardens, Ethan couldn't help but ask, "How do you keep going? After all you've seen and done, how do you still believe in peace?" Kalira paused, looking around at the lush greenery surrounding them. "Because I have seen what happens when we don't. When we lose hope, we lose everything. But if we fight for peace, if we build it together, we can create something better." Ethan didn't have a response, but he didn't need one. He understood now. Peace wasn't a simple thing. It wasn't something that could be won overnight. But with Kalira's strength and his own willingness to learn, maybe, just maybe, they could achieve it. As the sun set over the Kolan capital, Ethan realized that the warrior who had once seemed so distant and untouchable was no longer just a symbol of strength. She was a partner, a guide, and perhaps the key to unlocking the future they all desperately needed. The peaceful days that followed Kalira's conversation with Ethan were a welcome change. However, the calm was short-lived. The rogue faction of the Kolan, who had been absent from the peace talks, began to stir once more. Whispers of rebellion spread across the camp, and Ethan could feel the tension in the air grow heavier with each passing hour. Even the usually steady Kalira seemed more on edge as she spent long hours with the Kolan leaders, discussing the growing threat. One evening, as Ethan walked through the barracks, he overheard a heated argument between several of the Kolan generals. Their voices were low, but there was no mistaking the urgency in their tone. The rogue faction was planning to attack the peaceful faction, and their goal was simple: destroy the peace talks and return the Kolan to a state of constant war. Kalira was going to lead the charge against them. Ethan had been involved in many peace negotiations before, but none like this. The weight of the situation was starting to press down on him. As much as he wanted to help, he knew his place was not on the battlefield. He had come to this planet to ensure peace, not to fight. But the reality of the situation was stark. If the rogue faction succeeded in their mission, the lives of millions would be at risk. Peace would be lost forever. Later that night, as he sat alone in his quarters, Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his door. He stood up quickly, already knowing who it would be. Kalira entered without waiting for permission, her presence commanding as always. She was wearing her full battle armor, and her face was set in the same unreadable expression he had come to recognize. "Ethan," she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "The rogue faction has made their move. We are preparing to leave for the front lines. The talks are at risk of ending before they even begin." Ethan nodded, his stomach twisting with a mixture of anxiety and determination. "What do you need me to do?" Kalira looked at him for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying him as if weighing his every word. "Stay back. Keep out of the way. The battlefield is no place for diplomats." "I can't do that," Ethan said quickly, stepping forward. "I'm here to help. I may not be a fighter, but I can't stand by while the peace we've worked for is destroyed." Kalira's expression softened just for a moment. "You're not a soldier. You don't belong out there." "I'm not asking to fight," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "I'm asking to help. You need someone to keep the communication open between the factions. I'll stay out of the way, but I'll help with the logistics, the strategy. I know how to organize things. Just let me do my part." Kalira studied him for a long moment, as though considering his request. Then without another word, she nodded. "Fine, but stay behind the front lines. If you put yourself in danger, I will have you removed from the field." Ethan agreed, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew he could help. And this was his chance to prove that his skills were valuable beyond diplomacy. It wasn't just about talking anymore. It was about ensuring that the Kolan and humans could move forward together, no matter the cost. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing beside Kalira and the Kolan generals, overlooking the rugged terrain where the rogue faction was expected to attack. The air was thick with tension, and the battlefield, which had once seemed distant and foreign to him, now felt too close. He was no longer a mere observer. He had a part to play in what was about to unfold. Kalira's warriors stood in formation, their eyes focused and their weapons at the ready. Ethan couldn't help but notice the fierce determination on their faces. These weren't just soldiers, they were protectors, fighting not for personal glory but for the future of their people. As they prepared to move out, Kalira turned to Ethan once more. "Stay close. I may need your help organizing communication between the leaders." Ethan nodded. He had expected this, and though the situation was dangerous, he knew he had a role to play. He wasn't a warrior, but he could assist with tactics, timing, and strategy. As Kalira led her warriors toward the front, Ethan followed, keeping his distance but remaining close enough to offer assistance when needed. The battle began just before dawn, as the rogue faction launched a surprise attack on the Kolan defenses. The first wave was met with fierce resistance, but Ethan could see that the rogue faction had prepared well. They were well armed, and had brought their own formidable warriors. The air was filled with the sounds of shouting, clashing weapons, and the pounding of boots on the ground. The battle was already becoming more intense than Ethan had anticipated. Kalira led her troops with unwavering precision, her sword flashing in the sunlight as she cut through the enemy ranks. Ethan watched from a distance, his heart racing, as he saw the brutality of the battle unfold. He wasn't prepared for the sight of so much violence, but he also couldn't look away. Kalira moved with such grace and power that it was almost mesmerizing. As the battle raged on, Ethan moved between the commanders, helping relay messages and offering logistical support. His role was small, but he could see that it was vital. The Kolan were winning, but the rogue faction was determined, and they fought fiercely to gain ground. It was clear that this would not be an easy victory. Hours passed and the battle showed no signs of slowing. Ethan could feel the exhaustion settling in, not just for the soldiers, but for him as well. He wasn't used to this kind of stress, but he refused to falter. Every time he relayed a message, every time he helped coordinate a strategy, he knew he was contributing to the cause in his own way. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rogue faction began to retreat. The Kolan had won, but at a great cost. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers from both sides. The warriors moved quickly to secure the area, but the victory felt hollow. There would be no true peace without sacrifice. Kalira stood in the center of the field, her armor splattered with the dust and blood of battle. She was breathing heavily, but her posture remained as strong as ever. Ethan approached her cautiously, not sure what to say. "We did it," he said quietly. Kalira didn't look at him at first. Her eyes were scanning the battlefield, her gaze distant and focused. "Yes, but it is not enough. Peace is fragile. One battle does not make it permanent." Ethan nodded. He understood what she meant. This battle was won, but the war for peace was far from over. He had seen firsthand how hard it was to maintain peace, especially when so much was at stake. "Do you think it's possible?" he asked, his voice low. Kalira turned to face him, her eyes filled with something he hadn't expected. "Vulnerability. I hope so," she said. "But it will take more than just fighting. It will take trust, and that is something we are still working toward." Ethan didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. If they were going to make peace last, they would need each other, human and Kolan alike. It wouldn't be easy, but after everything they had been through, he believed it was worth fighting for. The dust had barely settled from the battle when the Kolan warriors began tending to the wounded and securing the area. The air, once thick with the sound of clashing weapons and shouting, was now eerily quiet. Ethan stood at the edge of the battlefield, feeling the weight of the day's events settle in his chest. The rogue faction had been defeated, but at a cost. The ground was littered with the fallen, both Kolan and enemy alike. The victory felt bittersweet. Kalira was standing at the center of the field, her tall form a commanding presence even in the aftermath of the battle. Her armor was covered in dust, but she didn't seem to care. Her eyes, however, were filled with a deep sadness. Ethan knew that the true cost of war went beyond the physical. The Colon had lost many good soldiers today, and while they had won the battle, the emotional toll was heavy. Ethan approached her cautiously, unsure of what to say. He had seen the Colon warriors in battle before, but this was different. This wasn't just about fighting. It was about protecting something far greater than themselves. Peace. And that peace had been threatened yet again. "You did it," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Kalira didn't respond right away. She was kneeling beside one of her fallen comrades, her fingers brushing gently over the soldier's face. It was a moment of silence, a private moment of grief. Ethan stood back, giving her the space she needed. But he couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. She had just lost someone close to her, someone who had fought by her side for years. Finally, Kalira stood, her back straight and her expression returning to its usual stoic nature. She turned to face Ethan, her eyes hardening slightly as she spoke. "We won the battle, but the cost is always too high. I will never understand why war is necessary." Ethan nodded, understanding her frustration. He had seen the same thing on Earth. War seemed like an endless cycle, one that never truly solved anything. But here, on Kolar, it felt even more personal. This was her people's way of life. This was all she knew. "I know," he said softly. "I wish it could be different, but sometimes fighting is the only way to protect what we care about." Kalira's eyes softened slightly, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something vulnerable in her gaze. But it was gone before he could be sure. She didn't speak for a long while, instead looking out over the battlefield, her mind clearly miles away. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "You should go. Rest. You've done your part. I will make sure the peace talks continue, but there is much to be done." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Kalira raised a hand, silencing him. "This is not a place for diplomats anymore. We will fight to protect the peace we've worked so hard to build. You cannot help us in this, but you can help in other ways." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He understood what she meant. The Colon had won the battle, but there was still much to be done to ensure that peace was maintained. He wasn't a soldier. He couldn't fight in the trenches with them. But he could help in other ways. He could help organize the peace talks, keep communication flowing between the different factions, and make sure that the sacrifices made today weren't in vain. "All right," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever I can to help." Kalira nodded, her eyes briefly meeting his before she turned away. "Good. We will need you. But know this, human. Peace is not easily won. It will take time, and it will take trust. The path ahead is not an easy one." As she walked away, Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for the warrior. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and yet she still carried herself with the strength and dignity of someone who had seen countless battles. But now there was something more, something different about the way she looked at him. It wasn't just respect, it was trust. In the following days, the Kolan camp remained tense, but there was a renewed sense of determination. The rogue faction had been defeated, but it was clear that they were not the only threat to peace. There were still deep divides between the Kolan people, between the factions who had once been allies and now found themselves at odds with one another. The task ahead was enormous, but Ethan was no longer afraid. He had a role to play, and he would do whatever it took to help. Kalira remained by his side throughout the process, though their interactions were quieter, more thoughtful. They spent long hours together, discussing the next steps for the peace talks. There was still a lot of work to be done, and the stakes were higher than ever. But with each passing day, Ethan could see the trust growing between them. They were no longer just a diplomat and a warrior. They were partners in this mission for peace. One evening, as the two of them sat together in a quiet corner of the camp, Kalira spoke again. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "You were right about something. Ethan looked up surprised. What do you mean? She glanced at him briefly before looking away, her gaze focusing on the campfires in the distance. About fighting for something we care about. I've spent so many years fighting for my people for Kolar that I've forgotten why I fight in the first place. It's not just about strength or honor. It's about protecting those we love. Ethan felt a surge of warmth in his chest. He could see the vulnerability in her words, the honesty. This wasn't the warrior he had first met. This was someone who had learned the true cost of war and was now seeking something more. Peace. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe it was possible. I'm glad we're on the same side, Ethan said quietly. Kalira turned. To him then, her eyes meeting his with a rare, soft intensity. So am I, human. So am I. As the night settled over the camp and the sounds of the battle began to fade into the distance, Ethan realized that the bond between him and Kalira was something far more profound than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about diplomacy or strength. It was about understanding each other's struggles, trusting each other, and working towards something greater than themselves. For the first time since he had arrived on Kolar, Ethan felt like he was part of something bigger. He wasn't just a diplomat from Earth anymore. He was a partner in this fight for peace, and with Kalira by his side, he felt more confident than ever that they could make it a reality.